Good day, everyone. I am John, moderator for this webinar on behalf of the organizer conference panel. I welcome everyone for today's webinar, HIPAA Security and the Safe Harbor Law, following good practices, limits, audits, and penalties. I would now like to introduce our presenter for today, Jim Sheldon Dean. Jim Sheldon Dean is the founder and director of compliance services at Lewis Creek System, LLC, a Vermont-based consulting firm founded in 1982, providing information, privacy, and security regulatory compliance services to a wide variety of healthcare entities. He is a frequent speaker regarding HIPAA. Sheldon Dean has more than 2 decades of experience specialization in HIPAA compliance. I would now like to hand over the floor to the speaker. Over to you, Jim.
All right, thank you very much, and welcome everybody to today's session looking at HIPAA security and the Safe Harbor Law. All right, so our agenda will be quickly on the agenda slide, and we'll go through all these various actions here, but we'll be looking to see what the security requirements are, what are the typical violations, some of the penalties that might occur, what are some of the current information security issues that might be a problem, and what the importance is of having good practice in security so that you can use the HIPAA Safe Harbor Law to reduce your penalties and reduce the fines, the length of inquiries that might take place if there is some kind of a enforcement action that takes place. And so the important thing is to meet the Safe Harbor requirement. If you do meet the Safe Harbor requirements, it makes it if you have something like a breach of some kind, it does give you some extra protections to keep those penalties down. So the idea is to have the proper documentation in place to be able to show that you have good Safe Harbor compliance. We talked about the privacy, security, and breach notification rule. The HIPAA privacy rule is all about the rights of individuals and the controls on the organizations that are holding their data, and what rights the individuals have, and how that balances out with what the organizations can do. A big issue in that world is in the privacy rule is access of health information. There's some rules that provide for individuals to have access to their health information, and that's a big issue for Health and Human Services these days. That's in the privacy rule realm. But also privacy rule, if there's a privacy rule violation, it may also be a security rule violation. Security rule applies to all the electronic information. It's very flexible and customizable, and helps give you the ability to understand what technology you're using today and how you're using information today, so that you can think about where the risks may occur in your handling of information, so that you can identify those risks and plan for their mitigation. So when it comes to the breach notification rule, that really fits in with both privacy and security. If you don't have a privacy rule violation, you don't have a breach. But if you have a privacy rule violation, you better stop and ask yourself, is this actually a reportable breach or not? If it's an acquisition, access, use, or disclosure that's in violation of the privacy rule, that's your basic definition of a breach. Now, there's some exceptions. There's some reasons why you might not have to report it, but you have to do that investigation and see what the story is. So breach notification has been enforceable for more than 10 years now, so it really is no excuse for not following the rule appropriately. But the important thing is to learn what's happened to others by looking at the HHS Wall of Shame, which is the website where they report all the large breaches that have occurred. So you can see what's happened and what went wrong for other organizations, so that perhaps you can take steps not to allow those things to happen to you. So the security rule has these various safeguards: physical, technical, and administrative safeguards. And as I mentioned before, about half of the safeguards are administrative safeguards in nature. They're process related. And it requires you to do some risk analysis to assess the information security risk issues. The idea is that you have to look and see what might go wrong in your organization, and then put the proper safeguards in place to keep those things from happening. And if you can show you've done that kind of thinking and have put those kind of safeguards in place, that can help qualify you for safe harbor treatment if there's some kind of a violation or a mistake or attack of some kind. Now, the security rule itself hasn't changed much since it was put in place. It's basically the same rules. It's been expanded to cover business associates as well, but it can still deal with emerging technologies because it doesn't use overly specific definitions in the regulations. It doesn't use any kinds of details of specifically what you should do. It's more principle-oriented and goal-oriented, so that you can think it through and decide what's reasonable for you to do in your circumstances, depending on how you do business. So you really need to look in terms of, and I like to use both these terms here, so don't get scared away. You have to look at risk analysis. What is it for? Risk analysis and risk assessment both are required, and HHS is confused about these terms, and they kind of substitute risk assessment for risk analysis. I like to use the two terms because it actually helps me understand things a little better. Risk analysis is where you do your information flow analysis. Find out where your information is, where it's coming from, where it's going, what systems it's sitting on, how it's being communicated. To understand where you might need to look for problems, you have to have this good big picture view. Then, wherever you have data sitting someplace or moving someplace, you can dive in and do a risk assessment of that system or flow and see what are the risks involved, okay? And then you back out to your risk analysis viewpoint standing out at the 30,000-foot view and compare all your assessments to see, well, where are our biggest problems? What do you have to deal with first? So you have to have that big picture. You have to be able to dive in, look at the details, and then be able to step back to the big picture again so you can compare things and see what are the most important things to deal with first, because you're never going to have time to fix everything. So the various safeguards you have to think about, we have in 164.308, I have 2 slides worth of safeguards, they're administrative safeguards. You have to have a security management process. You have to do your risk analysis. On these slides here where you see the R in parentheses, that means it's required. The A's are addressable, okay? And you'll see a lot of the addressable stuff has to do with the size of the organization. I mean, you wouldn't expect the same kind of processes and things taking place at a large academic teaching hospital that you would expect out of a small, 1 or 2 physician practice, small office, okay? So you have to have a security management process. You have to do some risk analysis and have risk management done, plan how you're going to deal with the risk. You have to have some sanctions policies in place to deal with people who break the rules and punish them if they do break the rules, even if it's a CEO. And do some regular information system activity reviews. These are the most important things to do, okay? And whoever has greater access requires greater precautions. The most dangerous people in your organization are the IT people that you rely on, because they have to have access to all kinds of stuff. If one of those guys turns out to be a rogue, that can be a very, very bad situation for you. There are people who have gone rogue and locked up entire city government systems. It happened in San Francisco not that many years ago. Now, physical safeguards is a matter of locking the doors, having access controls in place. Not everybody has to have a name tag, but you need to know who everybody is, or at least be able to recognize somebody who doesn't belong, okay? And if anybody sees somebody who doesn't belong, they need to be prepared to challenge them and say, I'm sorry, I don't recognize you. May I help you? Or how may I help you is actually the right question to use. How may I help you? And these days, people haven't seen each other because they haven't been in the offices for a long time. So there can be a lot of this going on, but you may have to do some questioning to make sure that you know who is where they are and do they have rights to be there. So you have to have good facility access control, good workstation use and security policies and procedures so that people know how to use their computers and don't use them in dangerous ways. Make sure they don't leave the monitor so somebody else can see what the information is that's on it. You need to have good device and media controls. I mean, before you get rid of or reuse old devices or an old computer or something like that, you want to make sure you wipe all the old data off of there, okay? You have to clear it off. And also, you have to have some accountability. If you're doing backups and you're taking a copy of your backup off-site on a daily basis or whatever, you better have a record of who took the backup off-site, some kind of a log that logs it out when it leaves the office and logs it in when it gets to the storage area, so you know who is in charge of what and where it was if anything should go wrong. There's also finally, after all this discussion of safeguards, we finally get to the technical safeguards, and those are things like having unique user identification, some way to break in through the access controls if necessary. You always have to be prepared for an emergency and unexpected circumstances. You have to be able to handle something like an automatic log off, like I talked about before, which is an addressable item. And encryption and decryption of data at rest. It's an addressable item. There's nothing that says that you have to encrypt. There's something that says you have to decide whether you should encrypt or not, and then do so as appropriate. That's what addressable means, remember? Okay, so it doesn't say you have to encrypt. It says you have to consider encryption. And if it's appropriate, you better do it, okay? And you need to have audit controls in place. You have to have the ability to look and see what's been going on, to make sure you know if people have been going and looking at records or systems or files that they shouldn't be. Okay, if you don't have the ability to do that, how are you going to tell? Do your best to have some audit controls in place so you can actually do those reviews, and then you have to do those reviews. Okay, if you don't do those reviews, you're leaving yourself open for all kinds of problems. There's one organization that even had a consultant come in and say, "Hey, you better do some audits here to make sure that people are just looking at the data they should, because it could be a problem." You have to make sure you have good integrity of your data. You also have to have a good person or entity authentication. You need to know who are the entities who are logging in. And you have to be able to document that you have done a good job for your safe harbor compliance. So you have to have your policies and procedures in place. All right. Well, thank you very much for participating in the session today. It's been my pleasure to talk with you about the safe harbor law and how to be prepared for it and how it can serve you when it comes to HIPAA compliance. So again, if there's questions you have later, you can always try reaching out to me by email. I'll do what I can to try and answer questions for you. In the meantime, please enjoy the remainder of your day.